For almost 90 years, a vast land of ancient civilizations was ruled directly by a foreign crown. Railways crossed plains. Laws reshaped societies, and decisions made in distant offices controlled the lives of millions. This period became known as the British Raj, a system of rule that defined modern India and changed the course of history. This is the story of the British Raj explained. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for being here and for choosing to explore history together. Today's story explains the British Raj, the period when Britain ruled India directly from 1858 to 1947. It was a time of administration and control, of reforms and resistance, and of an empire trying to govern a land far larger and more complex than itself. Understanding the British Raj helps us understand how empire worked and why it eventually failed. Was the British Raj a system meant to bring order and stability, or a structure designed mainly to maintain control and serve imperial interests? Share your thoughts, and let us begin. In the middle of the 19th century, British power in India rested on an uneasy foundation. For more than 200 years, the East India Company had expanded from a trading enterprise into a ruling authority. It collected revenue, commanded armies, and governed millions. Yet beneath the appearance of control, pressure was building, shaped by resentment, fear, and profound change. By 1857, the company ruled vast territories with a small European leadership. Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, formed the backbone of company power. They enforced its authority, fought its wars, and guarded its interests. Despite their service, many felt increasingly alienated. Pay inequalities, limited promotion, and disregard for cultural traditions weakened loyalty that had once seemed secure. Beyond the army, Indian society was undergoing disruption. Land reforms altered traditional ownership. Local rulers were removed or sidelined. Courts and laws replaced long-standing customs. Missionary activity and social policies stirred anxiety among communities who feared their beliefs and ways of life were under threat. These changes did not affect everyone equally, but together they created an atmosphere of deep unease. In early 1857, unrest within the army turned into open defiance. Acts of disobedience spread rapidly, carried by rumor and shared grievance. What began in military cantonments soon reached towns and villages. Indian soldiers and civilians rose against company authority, challenging symbols of foreign rule. The rebellion spread across northern India with startling speed. Civilians joined the uprising, driven by anger, hope, or desperation. Some local leaders stepped forward, seeking to reclaim lost authority or resist further intrusion. The revolt was not unified in purpose, but it was united in opposition. For British officials, the shock was immense. The company had believed its control was firm, supported by loyalty and discipline. Instead, it faced a widespread challenge that threatened its very existence. Communication lines were disrupted, garrisons were isolated, and fear spread among European communities. Britain responded with urgency and force. Troops were rushed from across the empire. Loyal units were reinforced, and a determined campaign was launched to retake key cities and restore order. The struggle that followed was prolonged and intense, marked by sieges, counteroffensives, and sweeping reprisals. By 1858, the rebellion had been crushed. Superior resources, coordination, and reinforcements allowed British forces to regain control. Resistance collapsed region by region. The cost was heavy. Towns were damaged, communities were fractured, and trust between rulers and ruled was deeply scarred. In the aftermath, punishment followed swiftly. Authority was reasserted with severity. The scale of the uprising forced a reckoning in Britain itself. The revolt exposed the limits of company rule. A commercial corporation had been allowed to govern a vast and complex society. Its priorities had often been profit and efficiency, not long-term stability. The events of 1857 made clear that this system had failed. In London, debate turned into action. The British government decided that India could no longer be ruled by a private company. Responsibility for governance had to rest with the state. In 1858, the East India Company was formally dissolved. Its armies, territories, and administration were transferred to the British Crown. This decision marked a historic turning point. For the first time, Britain assumed direct responsibility for ruling India. Authority was reorganized under a new system that became known as the British Raj. Power now flowed from the Crown, represented in India by a viceroy. The British government promised more careful administration and greater respect for Indian traditions. The army was reorganized, recruitment patterns changed, and greater attention was given to managing religious and cultural sensitivities. The transition was presented as reform and renewal. This decision marked a historic turning point. Yet the core reality remained unchanged. India was ruled without consent. Decision-making stayed in British hands. And Indian participation in governance was limited. The Raj sought stability and control above all else, shaped by the fear that another rebellion might erupt. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. The company, long resented, was gone. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The Crown now ruled where a corporation once had. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The Crown now ruled where a corporation once had. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. The company, long resented, was gone. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The Crown now ruled where a corporation once had. Yet the core reality remained unchanged. India was ruled without consent. Decision-making stayed in British hands. And Indian participation in governance was limited. The Raj sought stability and control above all else, shaped by the fear that another rebellion might erupt. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. The company, long resented, was gone. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The Crown now ruled where a corporation once had. Yet the core reality remained unchanged. India was ruled without consent. Decision-making stayed in British hands. And Indian participation in governance was limited. The Raj sought stability and control above all else, shaped by the fear that another rebellion might erupt. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. The company, long resented, was gone. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The Crown now ruled where a corporation once had. Yet the core reality remained unchanged. India was ruled without consent. Decision-making stayed in British hands. And Indian participation in governance was limited. The Raj sought stability and control above all else, shaped by the fear that another rebellion might erupt. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. The company, long resented, was gone. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The Crown now ruled where a corporation once had. Yet the core reality remained unchanged. India was ruled without consent. Decision-making stayed in British hands. And Indian participation in governance was limited. The Raj sought stability and control above all else, shaped by the fear that another rebellion might erupt. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. The company, long resented, was gone. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The crown now ruled where a corporation once had. Yet the core reality remained unchanged. India was ruled without consent. Decision-making stayed in British hands. And Indian participation in governance was limited. The Raj sought stability and control above all else, shaped by the fear that another rebellion might erupt. For Indians, the end of company rule brought mixed emotions. The company, long resented, was gone. But it was replaced not by self-rule, but by a stronger and more centralized imperial authority. The crown now ruled where a corporation once had. Yet the core reality remained unchanged. India was ruled without consent. Decision-making stayed in British hands. The memory of 1857 lingered on both sides. For the British, it became a warning that justified caution and control. For Indians, it stood as a powerful symbol of resistance and sacrifice, even in defeat. Stories of courage and loss passed quietly through families and communities. Between 1857 and 1858, India crossed a decisive threshold. The collapse of company rule reshaped the structure of empire. What followed was not the end of foreign domination, but the beginning of a new phase. More centralized and more deliberate. The British Raj was born from crisis. It emerged from rebellion, fear, and the recognition that power could no longer be exercised in the old way. The end of company rule closed one chapter of history. But it opened another that would shape the fate of India for nearly a century. In 1858, a new chapter of rule began across the Indian subcontinent. Authority was no longer exercised by a trading company acting in its own name. India was now governed directly under the authority of the British Crown. This shift was presented as a moment of stability and renewal. A promise that order would replace uncertainty after years of tension and conflict. The change in governance was swift and deliberate. A viceroy was appointed as the Crown's highest representative in India, acting as both ruler and administrator. From grand offices in major cities, the viceroy oversaw a vast system. The change in governance was swift and deliberate. British officials occupied the key positions of power. Administration, finance, and law were firmly in their hands. Civil servants drafted policies, collected revenue, and enforced regulations. Judges interpreted laws written within an imperial framework. Military officers ensured that authority was respected. Together, they formed a structure intended to be efficient, disciplined, and enduring. Power was drawn steadily toward the center. Provincial governments existed, but their autonomy was limited. Major decisions required approval from higher authorities. The flow of information moved upward, while instructions moved downward. This hierarchy reduced uncertainty for the rulers, but it also narrowed the space for local voices. For many Indians, governance became something distant and impersonal. Laws were applied uniformly, yet they were often shaped without meaningful consultation. Administrative language emphasized order and procedure, sometimes at the expense of local context. Stability was achieved, but participation remained rare. The people felt disconnected from the government, with their voices unheard. Indian involvement in governance was carefully restricted. Advisory councils were created, offering limited opportunities for discussion. A small number of Indian elites were invited to contribute opinions, but they did not hold decisive power. Final authority rested firmly with British officials. Participation was symbolic rather than transformative. The system reflected deep caution. British administrators feared instability above all else. The memory of past unrest influenced every policy. Centralization was seen as protection. Control was viewed as necessity. Political inclusion was considered a risk to be managed rather than a goal to be pursued. Infrastructure became a key instrument of authority. Railways expanded rapidly, linking distant regions to administrative centers. Telegraph lines followed, carrying messages across vast distances in moments. Orders from the capital reached remote districts quickly. Reports returned just as fast. Local officials were monitored more closely than ever before. The Crown's presence, though distant in person, was constant in effect. British governance was framed as rational and modern. Officials spoke of law, order, and progress. They believed centralized administration would bring peace and predictability. From the imperial perspective, India was being guided toward stability through firm and careful rule. Yet beneath this confidence lay contradiction. The system relied heavily on Indian labor and cooperation, but it did not extend political trust. Indian soldiers guarded imperial interests. Indian clerks maintained records and correspondence. Indian workers built railways and roads. Still, authority remained reserved for others. Economic policy reinforced this structure. Revenue collection was tightly controlled. Taxes supported administration, infrastructure, and the military. Decisions about spending priorities were made at high levels, often far removed from the communities affected. Efficiency mattered more than consent. By the 1870s, the Crown sought to strengthen the symbolic foundations of its rule. Ceremony and spectacle played an increasing role. In 1876, Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. This title carried deep meaning. It asserted that India was not merely governed, but possessed, bound directly to the monarchy. The declaration was accompanied by elaborate ceremonies designed to inspire loyalty and awe. For British officials, the title of Empress reinforced the idea of a unified empire under a single sovereign. For many Indians, it was a powerful symbol of distance. The ruler was exalted and remote, elevated above everyday realities. Authority felt absolute, yet unreachable. Despite outward stability, political freedom remained absent. The structures of governance allowed little room for dissent or initiative. Laws could be discussed, but not reshaped. Policies could be debated, but not directed. The Crown ruled through control, not partnership. Education expanded during this period, creating a growing class of educated Indians. Schools and colleges taught administrative skills, law, and language. These institutions produced capable professionals who served the system. At the same time, education introduced ideas about rights and representation that extended beyond imperial intentions. As awareness spread, so did quiet questioning. Why was participation so limited? Why did authority remain concentrated in foreign hands? Between 1858 and 1876, the Crown consolidated its control over India. Centralized power replaced company rule. The viceroy became the symbol of imperial authority. Administration, finance, and law were firmly aligned with British interests. The declaration of Queen Victoria as Empress marked the height of this consolidation. It confirmed the Raj as a formal and direct expression of empire. British authority appeared secure, structured, and confident. Yet the foundations of this power were narrow. Stability had been achieved without inclusion. Order had been enforced without shared governance. The Crown had taken charge, but it ruled a society that was watching, learning, and slowly redefining its expectations. The years ahead would test whether control alone could sustain authority. For now, the Raj stood firm, centralized and commanding, its symbols bright and its structures strong. Even as the deeper currents of change quietly gathered strength beneath the surface. Across the vast landscapes of British India, power was not held only by soldiers or governors. The British Raj relied on bureaucracy to function. Paperwork, procedures, and hierarchy became the invisible framework that allowed a small foreign administration to govern millions of people spread across an entire subcontinent. At the heart of this system stood the Indian civil service. Often described as the steel frame of British rule. It was designed to be efficient, disciplined, and loyal to the crown. Its members were few in number but immense in authority. Through them, imperial policy reached the most distant villages and towns. At the heart of this system, recruitment into the service was highly selective. Examinations were demanding and initially held far from India, favoring British candidates. Those who succeeded were trained to believe they carried a civilizing mission. From the beginning, distance from the governed was seen as a strength rather than a weakness. Once appointed, civil servants were posted across India, often alone or in very small teams. A single district officer might be responsible for hundreds of thousands of people. From a modest office, he represented the authority of the Raj. His signature could shape lives, determine taxes, and enforce laws. District administration became the core unit of governance. Officers collected land revenue, supervised police forces, and oversaw courts. They monitored local conditions, reported upward, and implemented orders from above. In theory, they were neutral administrators. In practice, they held immense discretionary power. Efficiency was the guiding principle. Decisions were expected to be quick and firm. Files moved through a strict chain of command. Rules were written to standardize behavior across regions with vastly different cultures and traditions. Uniformity was valued more than local variation. Detailed records tracked land ownership, population, and revenue. Surveys and censuses turned society into data. Maps and reports allowed distant officials to imagine control over territories they might never visit. Knowledge became a tool of rule. Yet representation was not a priority. Indians were largely excluded from senior positions for much of the Raj. Those governed had little say in how they were governed. Consultation was limited, and participation restricted. Authority flowed downward, not upward. For many officials, isolation was a defining experience. District officers lived far from major cities, separated from local society by language, culture, and privilege. Social distance reinforced administrative distance. Governance was firm, but rarely intimate. Supporters of the system argued that this distance ensured fairness. Officials were expected to rise above local interests and apply the law impartially. The image of the incorruptible administrator became central to imperial identity. Discipline and personal sacrifice were praised as virtues. Critics saw something else. They observed a system that valued order over understanding and control over consent. Decisions made in offices could disrupt communities without dialogue. Efficiency often came at the cost of empathy. The civil service also worked closely with other pillars of rule. Revenue departments ensured steady income. Police forces enforced compliance. Courts applied laws written far away. Together, they formed a tightly connected structure that reinforced authority at every level. Over time, the system adapted but did not fundamentally change. Limited reforms introduced advisory councils and expanded Indian participation at lower levels. However, real power remained concentrated. The hierarchy stayed intact, guarding its autonomy and traditions. Crises revealed both the strength and limits of bureaucracy. During famines, floods, or unrest, officials mobilized resources and enforced order. Yet rigid procedures sometimes slowed response. Rules designed for stability struggled under extraordinary pressure. They challenged the idea that distant administrators should decide their future. Bureaucracy, once invisible, became visible as a barrier to self-rule. Some Indian officials entered the service in later years, bringing new perspectives. They navigated a system shaped by imperial priorities, balancing loyalty to rules with awareness of local realities. Their presence hinted at change but did not overturn the structure. By the early 20th century, the Indian civil service still governed through hierarchy and routine. Its strength lay in its consistency and discipline. Its weakness lay in its separation from those it ruled. Governance remained firm, distant, and controlled. The British Raj depended on this administrative machine to survive. Armies could conquer territory, but bureaucracy held it together day after day. Files replaced force as the everyday language of power. As demands for representation grew louder, the limitations of bureaucratic rule became clearer. The civil service could manage, record, and enforce, but it could not inspire loyalty forever. Administration and the Indian civil service shaped the experience of empire more quietly than battles or proclamations. They defined how authority was felt in daily life. Through them, the Raj functioned with precision and order. It was effective, disciplined, and enduring, but it stood apart from the society it controlled. That distance would shape the future long after the Raj itself came to an end. British authority in India did not rely on soldiers alone. Alongside armies and administration came a vast system of law, order, and control. This system reached into courts, police stations, and prisons, reshaping society in ways that were lasting and profound. Power was enforced not only through force, but through rules written on paper and upheld by institutions. As British rule expanded, courts spread across the subcontinent. From major cities to provincial towns, legal buildings became symbols of authority. They stood as visible reminders that a new system governed daily life. Disputes that were once settled through custom or local leaders were now drawn into formal legal procedures. English legal principles formed the foundation of this transformation. Written law replaced oral tradition. Rules were standardized, documented, and enforced uniformly across wide regions. Contracts, property rights, and criminal codes followed models developed far from India. This shift altered how people interacted with authority. Justice was no longer personal or negotiable in the old sense. It was procedural, distant, and shaped by unfamiliar logic. Understanding the law required education, language skills, and access to officials. Local legal systems were gradually displaced. Village councils and traditional courts lost influence. Their decisions carried less weight than those of colonial judges. Over time, indigenous legal practices survived only at the margins of the new system. Courts became centers of imperial power. British judges and magistrates presided over cases involving land, trade, and personal disputes. Their rulings shaped economic life and social relations. Law did not merely resolve conflict. It structured society according to imperial priorities. To enforce these laws, police forces were expanded and reorganized. Uniformed constables appeared in towns and rural areas alike. They patrolled streets, guarded government buildings, and ensured compliance with regulations. Their presence made authority visible on a daily basis. Policing emphasized order and obedience. Rules governing movement, assembly, and public behavior were strictly enforced. The goal was stability. Preventing disorder mattered more than addressing its causes. Police answered to colonial administrators, not local communities. This separation limited accountability. While law claimed neutrality, enforcement often reflected the interests of those in power. Trust between the police and the public remained fragile. Prisons formed another pillar of control. New detention facilities were built to house those who violated colonial law. Punishment became systematic rather than arbitrary. Sentences were recorded, regulated, and enforced according to legal codes. Imprisonment served multiple purposes. It removed individuals from society, deterred resistance, and reinforced authority. The prison system demonstrated the reach of the state. No area of life was beyond regulation. Regulations extended far beyond criminal law. Economic activity was monitored and controlled. Land ownership, taxation, and labor practices were governed by legal frameworks. Compliance ensured participation in the colonial economy. Non-compliance carried consequences. Law provided a sense of order that benefited the empire. Trade became more predictable. Revenue collection was standardized. Administration functioned efficiently across vast territories. For British officials, this stability justified the system. Yet justice within this framework remained uneven. British subjects and Indian subjects were not treated equally. Legal privileges varied by status and race. Accountability was not always balanced. Access to justice depended on resources. Legal proceedings were complex and often costly. Those with education and means navigated the system more effectively. For many, the courts felt distant and intimidating. The language of law created further barriers. Proceedings were conducted in English or formal legal dialects. Interpreters mediated communication, adding layers of complexity. Misunderstanding was common, and outcomes often felt predetermined. Despite these challenges, Indians increasingly engaged with the legal system. Lawyers, clerks, and legal scholars emerged. They studied British law and learned to use it strategically. Some challenged authority through legal argument rather than confrontation. It became both a tool of control and a space of contest. It enforced imperial order, but also exposed its contradictions. Claims of fairness clashed with unequal practice. Promises of justice highlighted its absence. Over time, the reach of law reshaped everyday life. People adjusted behavior to avoid legal trouble. Communities adapted to regulations governing land, trade, and movement. The presence of law became routine, even when its fairness was questioned. Yet beneath this appearance lay tension. Law served imperial interests first. When stability conflicted with fairness, stability prevailed. Order was maintained, but equality was postponed. By the early 20th century, the system was deeply embedded. Institutions of law and order shaped governance and society alike. They defined the boundaries of acceptable action. They also revealed the limits of colonial justice. The legacy of this system endured beyond empire. Courts, policing, and legal codes did not vanish with independence. They were inherited, adapted, and contested by new nations. Their origins continued to influence how authority was exercised. British law had reshaped Indian society in lasting ways. It created structure, discipline, and control across a vast land. It brought stability that served imperial rule. But it also left unresolved questions of justice. Law, order, and control became the quiet architecture of empire. Less visible than armies, yet just as powerful. Through rules and institutions, Britain governed daily life. Order was achieved. Justice remained unequal. Across the vast landscape of India, movement once followed the pace of footpaths, rivers, and seasons. Distance shaped power. Messages took weeks. Authority weakened with every mile traveled. For the rulers of the Raj, this reality posed a challenge. Control over such a wide land demanded speed, reach, and connection. Infrastructure became the answer. The Raj invested heavily in railways, roads, and communication networks. These projects were presented as symbols of progress and modernity. Iron tracks, stone bridges, and telegraph wires promised to bind the subcontinent together. Beneath this promise lay a deeper purpose. Infrastructure was designed to make governance possible on an unprecedented scale. Railways expanded rapidly after 1860. What began as limited experimental lines soon stretched outward in all directions. Tracks cut through plains, forests, and hills. Construction camps appeared along routes still unfamiliar to maps. Laborers worked in harsh conditions, laying the foundation for a system that would transform movement across the land. By 1900, thousands of miles of track covered India. Trains connected ports to interiors, cities to markets, and administrative centers to distant provinces. Journeys that once took weeks could now be completed in days. The rhythm of travel changed. Time itself seemed to accelerate. For administration, the impact was immediate. Officials could be transferred quickly. Troops could be moved in large numbers. Supplies flowed with greater reliability. The railway timetable became a tool of authority, enforcing punctuality and coordination across regions. Control no longer depended on proximity alone. Roads complemented the railways. Existing routes were widened, resurfaced, and extended. New roads linked rural areas to railway stations and district centers. Carts, wagons, and later motor vehicles moved along paths once shaped only by local need. Roads became arteries of administration, carrying officials, goods, and information. Telegraphs transformed communication even more dramatically. Messages that once relied on couriers or ships now traveled at the speed of signals. Decisions made in distant offices could be communicated almost instantly. Crises were reported quickly. Orders returned without delay. The distance between center and province collapsed into moments. Administration became faster and more effective. Reports were filed promptly. Instructions were clarified. Coordination improved. The Raj could respond to events with a speed previously impossible. This efficiency strengthened authority, allowing governance to reach deeper into everyday life. Yet infrastructure did more than improve administration. It reshaped the economy. Railways moved raw materials from interior regions to ports. Coal, cotton, grain, and minerals traveled along fixed routes. Markets grew. Travel became possible for pilgrims, workers, and traders. Towns emerged along lines, drawing people and activity. The whistle of a train became a familiar sound. For others, change was disruptive. Traditional trade routes declined. Local industries struggled to compete with goods transported cheaply over long distances. The benefits of connectivity were uneven. Progress moved along tracks that did not stop everywhere. Roads and telegraphs also served military purposes. During unrest or conflict, troops could be deployed quickly. Supply lines were secured. Communication ensured coordination across regions. Infrastructure reduced the time needed to assert control, reinforcing the authority of the state. The design of these systems reflected priorities. Routes often connected resource-rich areas to ports rather than linking communities to one another. Efficiency favored extraction and administration over local development. The logic of empire shaped the map. Still, the physical presence of infrastructure left lasting marks. Bridges spanned rivers long considered barriers. Tunnels pierced hills. Stations became landmarks. These structures altered the visual and social landscape, embedding imperial priorities into everyday surroundings. Indian workers built much of this network. They labored under difficult conditions, often with little recognition. Their effort powered the transformation of movement and communication. The tracks they laid carried both progress and control, opportunity and imbalance. As years passed, infrastructure became inseparable from daily life. Trains carried news, people, and goods. Telegraph offices connected towns to wider worlds. Roads linked villages to markets and administrations. The network became part of the fabric of society, even as its origins reflected imperial intent. The Raj presented these projects as gifts of modernity. In reality, they were tools of governance. They enabled oversight, extraction, and rapid response. Infrastructure strengthened control while reshaping the land it crossed. Yet history does not remain fixed in intention. After empire, these same networks served new purposes. Railways and roads became assets of an independent nation. Communication systems supported national integration. What was built for control was adapted for unity. The legacy of railways, roads, and communication is therefore complex. They represent ambition and engineering skill. They reflect power and planning. They tell a story of how technology can both connect and dominate. In the end, steel tracks and silent wires carried more than trains and messages. They carried authority across distance. They reshaped how India was governed and experienced. The infrastructure of the Raj did not merely move people and goods. It moved power itself, faster and farther than ever before. Under the British Raj, economic control became one of the most powerful tools of governance. Administration did not rely only on laws or armies. It worked through taxes, land systems, trade rules, and production targets. That reshaped everyday life across the subcontinent. These policies were presented as orderly and efficient, yet their purpose was clear. The economy of India was organized to serve imperial needs first. Taxation lay at the heart of the system. Land revenue remained the main source of income for the government. Farmers were required to pay fixed amounts, often in cash, regardless of harvest conditions. In many regions, assessments were rigid and unforgiving. Failure to pay on time led to debt, loss of land, or legal punishment. For rural communities, this pressure changed priorities. Survival depended on meeting revenue demands, not on securing food for the future. Money became essential in villages that had once relied on local exchange. Fields that once grew food for local consumption were redirected toward export production. This shift made farmers vulnerable to lenders and market fluctuations they could not control. This focus brought short-term profits for traders and revenue for the state, but it reduced flexibility for farmers. When global prices fell or weather failed, communities had little protection. The land produced wealth, yet that wealth rarely stayed where it was grown. At the same time, traditional Indian industries declined. For centuries, artisans had produced textiles, metalwork, and other goods for regional and international trade. Under British rule, these industries struggled to compete. Cloth woven in distant mills replaced local fabrics. Workshops closed as demand collapsed. Skilled laborers lost livelihoods that had sustained families for generations. The decline was gradual but relentless, reshaping towns and cities that had once thrived on craft production. Trade policy favored imports over local manufacture. Tariffs protected British goods while Indian products faced barriers abroad. India became a market for empire and a source of raw materials. This imbalance was not accidental. It reflected the priorities of an imperial economy designed elsewhere. Infrastructure played a central role in this transformation. Railways connected mines, plantations, and ports, moving goods efficiently across long distances. Roads and canals supported trade and revenue collection. These developments were often praised as progress, yet their routes revealed their purpose. Rail lines ran from fields to harbors, not between villages. Grain could be exported quickly, even during shortages. The system moved resources outward, binding India tightly to global markets while weakening local resilience. The human cost of these policies became most visible during periods of famine. Throughout the 19th century, India experienced repeated food crises. Droughts occurred naturally, but their impact was intensified by economic structures that left little margin for survival. When crops failed, high taxes remained. Grain continued to move along railways toward export or storage for sale. Relief efforts existed, but they were limited by strict rules and hesitation to interfere with markets. Millions faced hunger while systems designed for profit continued to operate. The late 19th century saw some of the most severe famines. Entire regions suffered for months and years. Families sold possessions, livestock, and land to survive. Communities were permanently altered by loss and displacement. British officials debated responsibility and reform. Some argued that free markets should not be disturbed. Others called for greater intervention. Urban centers reflected similar patterns. New cities grew around ports and administrative hubs. Employment expanded in railways, offices, and factories linked to imperial trade. But these opportunities reached only a fraction of the population, leaving inequality stark and visible. Wealth concentrated in certain sectors while rural distress deepened. Economic growth existed on paper, measured through exports and revenue, but it did not translate into widespread security. Prosperity moved upward and outward. For many Indians, the economy felt distant and impersonal. Decisions affecting harvests, prices, and livelihoods were made far away, guided by imperial interests. Local voices carried little weight in shaping policy. By the end of the 19th century, criticism was growing. Indian thinkers, writers, and early political leaders began to analyze economic decline. They argued that poverty was not accidental, but structural. The economy, they claimed, had been reorganized to benefit empire at India's expense. These ideas spread quietly through books, speeches, and discussions. They did not immediately change policy, but they reshaped understanding. Economic hardship became linked to political power, planting seeds of resistance. The legacy of British economic policy was complex. Railways, canals, and global trade networks remained. But so did deep inequality, weakened industries, and rural vulnerability. Development had been selective, guided by extraction rather than balance. Economic governance under the Raj was efficient in one sense. It generated revenue and sustained imperial rule. Yet its impact on ordinary lives was harsh and enduring. Growth existed, but security did not. The economy served empire first and local welfare second. This order shaped daily experience for millions, defining work, food, and survival. Long after policies changed, their effects continued to shape the social and economic landscape of India. The story of economic rule under the British Raj is not just about numbers and trade. It reveals how power can shape prosperity, and how prosperity can be separated from well-being when policy serves distant interests above human needs. In 1885, a new current began to move through Indian public life. It was quiet at first, shaped by meetings in halls and homes rather than crowds in the streets. Educated Indians from different regions gathered to speak about shared concerns. For the first time, nationalism found organized expression, not as scattered voices, but as a collective presence. These early political leaders believed reform was possible within the existing system. They respected law and order and appealed to principles they believed the Raj itself claimed to uphold. Their demands were measured. They asked for representation, fairness in administration, and greater Indian involvement in decision-making. They used petitions, speeches, and resolutions to make their case. The language of this movement was careful and deliberate. It spoke of loyalty and cooperation, but also of rights and responsibility. Leaders argued that Indians, educated and capable, should have a greater role in governing their own land. They believed reasoned argument could bring gradual change. As these ideas spread, political awareness grew. Newspapers carried debates beyond meeting rooms. Pamphlets circulated in towns and cities. Issues once discussed privately entered public conversation. People began to think of themselves not only as subjects of local regions, but as part of a larger political community. Petitions to the government increased in number and scope. They addressed taxation, civil service access, and legislative reform. Public meetings drew larger audiences. Protest, though still restrained, became more visible. The act of speaking out itself marked a shift. Silence was no longer accepted as the only option. The Raj responded cautiously. British officials monitored developments closely. They recognized the growing confidence among Indian leaders, but feared the consequences of rapid change. Stability remained their priority. Reform was considered, but only within strict limits. In response, limited councils were introduced. These councils had narrow powers. They could discuss, but not decide. They could suggest, but not direct. Key areas such as finance, defense, and law remained firmly under British control. Participation was permitted, but authority was not shared. These councils had narrow powers. This gap between expectation and reality widened over time. Indian leaders gained experience in political organization, debate, and negotiation. With each session, they better understood the limits of the system. The language of requests slowly evolved into the language of rights. By the turn of the century, nationalism had matured. New voices emerged, more assertive in tone. They questioned not only policies, but structures of power. The idea that foreign rule could indefinitely deny political freedom began to lose acceptance. The Raj maintained its cautious approach. Officials balanced concession with control. Surveillance increased. Political gatherings were observed. Publications were scrutinized. The goal was to manage dissent without provoking it. Education played an unexpected role in this transformation. Schools and universities produced graduates fluent in law, history, and political theory. These individuals compared imperial ideals with imperial practice. Discrepancies became difficult to ignore. Economic pressures added to discontent. Taxation, land policies, and employment discrimination affected daily life. While infrastructure expanded and trade grew, benefits were uneven. Many felt excluded from prosperity in their own country. The relationship between rulers and ruled grew more strained. Mutual trust weakened. Protest was framed as moral persuasion rather than confrontation. The belief persisted that change could be achieved without violence, through unity and persistence. As years passed, regional identities continued to matter, but a shared political vocabulary began to form. Leaders from different backgrounds spoke of common goals. Unity, though imperfect, seemed possible. By 1914, the landscape had changed significantly. What began as polite petitioning had become a sustained challenge to exclusion. Nationalism was no longer limited to a small elite. Its ideas reached wider audiences, shaping expectations across society. The Raj still held power. Administration, law, and the military remained British. Yet authority now faced scrutiny it had not encountered before. Control was intact, but confidence was shaken. The period from 1885 to 1914 was marked by gradual awakening rather than dramatic rupture. Resistance grew through organization, discussion, and persistence. Nationalism took root not in sudden rebellion, but in steady assertion. Tension between rulers and ruled did not explode, but it deepened. Each reform raised new questions. Each limitation revealed the distance between promise and practice. As the world moved toward a new global conflict, India stood changed. Political awareness had spread. Expectations had risen. The foundations of resistance were firmly laid. Growing nationalism had reshaped the relationship between empire and society. The rulers still governed, but they were no longer unchallenged in thought. The ruled had begun to imagine a different future, one in which participation replaced permission. This period ended not with resolution, but with anticipation. The questions raised between 1885 and 1914 would not fade. They would return with greater force in the years ahead, carried by a generation that had learned to speak, organize, and persist. In 1914, the outbreak of World War I sent shockwaves through the British Empire. For the British Raj in India, the conflict became an immense test of authority, resources, and endurance. Decisions taken far away in imperial centers immediately reshaped life across the subcontinent. The war demanded loyalty, labor, and sacrifice on a scale never seen before. India was drawn into the conflict without consultation. As part of the empire, it was expected to support the war fully. Recruitment began rapidly, and soldiers were dispatched to distant fronts. Indian troops fought in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, often in unfamiliar climates and conditions. Their service became vital as British forces were stretched thin. Beyond manpower, India supplied money and materials. The colonial government redirected revenue toward military needs. Taxes increased, and loans were raised to finance the war effort. Agricultural output, raw materials, and manufactured goods were prioritized for imperial use. Railways and ports worked relentlessly to move troops and supplies. The administrative system of the Raj shifted its focus almost entirely to war needs. Civil servants managed recruitment, logistics, and revenue with urgency. Efficiency became the overriding goal. Development projects were delayed, and social concerns were pushed aside. Governance was measured by how effectively it could support the war. For ordinary people, the impact was immediate. Prices rose as shortages spread. Essential goods became harder to obtain. Rural communities felt pressure as food and transport were redirected. Urban centers grew crowded with workers and soldiers, straining housing and services. Daily life grew more uncertain as the war continued. The Raj relied heavily on control and coordination. Emergency powers expanded administrative authority over trade, movement, and communication. Public gatherings were monitored, and dissent was closely watched. Stability was considered essential, even if it meant limiting freedoms. At the same time, British officials understood that cooperation required reassurance. Indian soldiers and civilians were making enormous sacrifices. Statements spoke of progress, partnership, and greater inclusion once the war ended. These assurances spread hope across political circles. Many Indian leaders encouraged patience. They argued that loyalty during wartime would strengthen the case for reform afterward. The idea that sacrifice would be rewarded took hold. Expectations grew quietly, even as hardships continued. As the war dragged on, the gap between promise and reality widened. Administrative reforms remained slow and limited. Discussions replaced action. Committees were formed, reports written, and decisions delayed. For many, the language of reform felt distant from daily experience. When the war ended in 1918, relief was mixed with disappointment. Soldiers returned home with memories of hardship and service. They expected recognition and meaningful change. Instead, they found an administration cautious and hesitant, focused on restoring order rather than transforming governance. Economic disruption did not fade quickly. Inflation persisted, and employment was uncertain. The transition from wartime production strained industries and workers alike. Rural areas struggled to recover from years of pressure. The sense of shared sacrifice lingered, but rewards remained unclear. The war had altered perceptions of power. Indian soldiers had fought alongside Europeans, witnessing both strength and vulnerability. The image of an unchallenged empire had been weakened. The Raj had depended deeply on Indian support, revealing the limits of imperial control. Disappointment spread across Indian society. Political organizations expanded their reach, drawing in students, workers, and professionals. Questions grew louder. Why had sacrifice not brought swift reform? Why were decisions still made without Indian voices? The contrast between wartime promises and post-war reality sharpened resentment. British officials debated their approach. Some believed gradual reform was necessary to maintain stability. Others argued that firm control was essential to prevent unrest. This division led to inconsistent policy, alternating between concession and restriction. Each shift deepened uncertainty. The British Raj had survived the war. But it emerged changed. The administrative system had proven capable of mobilizing resources on a massive scale. Yet it had also revealed its dependence on extraction and authority rather than consent. Control had been maintained, but legitimacy had weakened. World War I tested the Raj in ways few had anticipated. It bound governance, economy, and military power together under extreme pressure. The machinery of empire functioned, but at significant social and political cost. By the end of the war years, India was no longer politically quiet. The experience of sacrifice without immediate reward left a lasting mark. Expectations had risen, and they could not easily be set aside. The relationship between ruler and ruled had been altered through prolonged strain. The war had shown that authority enforced through administration and control could meet urgent demands. But it could not restore faith. Promises delayed became sources of frustration. Efficiency without representation revealed its limits. As peace returned to the world, India stood at a turning point. The conflict had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. Disappointment had spread, confidence in imperial rule had weakened, and demands for change grew stronger. The Raj had passed the test of war, but it now faced a far greater challenge. The demand for a future shaped by Indian voices themselves. After 1919, British rule in India entered a period of constant strain. The war that had promised reform ended, but the reforms felt distant and incomplete. Across the subcontinent, patience gave way to pressure. Authority that once appeared stable now faced challenge from every direction. The years following the war were marked by awakening. Political awareness spread beyond elite circles into towns, villages, and workplaces. Ideas of self-governance were discussed openly. What had once been cautious petitioning turned into organized resistance. Protests became frequent and widespread. Crowds gathered in cities and rural centers alike. Boycotts, marches, and campaigns disrupted the routines of colonial administration. Participation crossed social and regional boundaries, giving resistance a national character. British officials struggled to respond. The administrative system had been designed for control, not consensus. Each protest demanded attention, resources, and restraint. The cost of maintaining order rose steadily. Political organizations expanded their reach. They coordinated actions across provinces, linking local grievances to national goals. Campaigns were planned with discipline and persistence. Resistance was no longer spontaneous. At the same time, economic pressures deepened unrest. Post-war inflation strained household budgets. Employment was uncertain, and agricultural hardship persisted. Political demands became inseparable from daily survival. British authority faced challenge not just in the streets, but in legitimacy. Questions were raised about the right to rule. Laws were enforced, yet acceptance of those laws weakened. Governance relied increasingly on compliance rather than consent. The response from Britain followed a familiar pattern. Reform was offered to relieve pressure. Control was tightened to prevent disorder. This balance proved difficult to maintain. New councils and assemblies expanded Indian participation. Elections were introduced in broader form. Indian leaders gained administrative responsibility in certain areas. These measures were presented as progress toward self-governance. Yet power remained limited. Key areas such as defense and finance stayed firmly under British control. Authority could be withdrawn through emergency provisions. Autonomy existed, but it was conditional. Alongside reform came repression. Public gatherings were regulated. Political leaders faced restrictions. Administrative powers were used to curb movements seen as threatening. This dual approach created uncertainty. Reforms raised expectations that repression could not satisfy. Each concession suggested weakness. Each restriction fueled further resistance. Britain began to reconsider the structure of colonial governance itself. The goal was to stabilize rule without surrendering control. The result was the Government of India Act of 1935. It was the most extensive reform of the colonial era. Provincial autonomy was expanded. Elected Indian ministers took office in several regions. For a moment, governance appeared to shift. Indian leaders managed education, health, and local administration. Public engagement with government increased. The system seemed to offer a path forward. But limitations soon became clear. The central government remained under British authority. Emergency powers allowed intervention at any time. The framework granted responsibility without full sovereignty. Reactions were mixed. Some leaders chose to work within the new system. Others criticized it as inadequate. Debate over cooperation and resistance continued. As the decade progressed, challenges multiplied. Administrative complexity increased. Coordination between British and Indian authorities proved difficult. The clarity of command that once defined the Raj was fading. International conditions added further strain. Economic instability affected imperial finances. Rising tensions elsewhere demanded British attention and resources. India could no longer be managed as before. Public confidence in colonial governance declined steadily. Laws were enforced, but loyalty weakened. The state could compel obedience, but it could not inspire trust. Authority existed, but legitimacy was slipping away. By the late 1930s, the signs of decline were unmistakable. Resistance was embedded in political culture. Self-governance was no longer a future ambition. It was an immediate demand. British officials sensed the change. Reports acknowledged difficulty. Language shifted from certainty to caution. Control required increasing effort for diminishing return. The Raj still stood, but it was under constant pressure. Its foundations had not collapsed, yet they were deeply cracked. Governance depended on compromise, enforcement, and delay. None offered a permanent solution. Between 1919 and 1939, British rule moved from dominance to defensiveness. Crisis became routine. Decline unfolded not in sudden collapse, but in gradual loss of control. This period reshaped the final years of empire. Resistance exposed the limits of authority. Reforms revealed uncertainty. The Raj survived the interwar years, but only barely. When the next global conflict arrived, the system would face demands it could not meet. The struggle of these 2 decades prepared the ground for what followed. Crisis and decline were no longer temporary conditions. They had become the defining reality of British rule in India. The end of the British Raj did not arrive as a sudden fall, but as a slow unraveling shaped by war, exhaustion, and changing realities. Between 1939 and 1947, the foundations of imperial rule weakened year by year, until the structure that had governed India for decades could no longer stand. World War II transformed the global balance of power. Britain entered the conflict as an imperial authority stretched across continents, yet the demands of total war soon exposed its limits. Industry was redirected toward survival. Resources were consumed at an unprecedented rate. Every decision carried urgency, and every reserve was tested. Troops were recruited in large numbers. Raw materials were extracted. Factories expanded production. Railways and ports operated at full capacity. The demands placed upon India were heavy and constant. Administration struggled to manage this pressure. Emergency powers increased control, but also deepened distance between rulers and the ruled. Decisions were made rapidly, often without consultation. Wartime necessity justified extraordinary measures, yet these measures carried lasting consequences for daily life. Economic pressure increased across the country. Inflation rose as resources were diverted toward the war effort. Prices climbed faster than wages. Shortages became common. Urban workers and rural communities alike felt the strain. Stability, once promised by imperial administration, became harder to maintain. The burden of war fell unevenly. Indian soldiers served across distant fronts, often far from home. Their contribution was immense, yet recognition remained limited. Families endured absence and uncertainty while coping with rising costs. The connection between sacrifice and reward felt increasingly fragile. Britannia's own condition deteriorated. Cities were damaged. Debt accumulated. The economy strained under years of conflict. Maintaining distant rule no longer commanded the same priority or confidence. The focus of government shifted inward, toward reconstruction and recovery. Within India, awareness grew. The contradiction between wartime rhetoric of freedom and the reality of colonial governance became more visible. Political expectations shifted. The belief that British authority was permanent began to fade, replaced by a growing sense that change was inevitable. By 1945, British power had weakened beyond repair. Victory in Europe did not restore imperial strength. Instead, it highlighted how much had been lost. The resources required to govern India effectively were no longer available. The will to continue was equally diminished. Administrative control still existed, but it lacked energy and legitimacy. Orders were issued, but their authority felt hollow. Negotiation replaced command. Delay replaced certainty. The desire to withdraw quickly shaped decisions. Complexity was acknowledged. But urgency dominated every calculation. In 1947, the British Raj ended. Authority was transferred, and the formal structures of imperial governance dissolved. The moment carried immense significance. A system that had shaped law, administration, and daily life for decades came to a close. India gained independence, stepping into a future defined by self-rule. Power shifted from imperial command to national responsibility. The change was historic, yet it carried weight as well as hope. Independence was not simply freedom from rule, but the beginning of a new challenge. The collapse of the Raj was not marked by a single battle or decree. It was the result of prolonged strain. War drained strength. Economic pressure exposed weakness. Political reality shifted beyond control. Empire faded not through defeat alone, but through exhaustion. For many, independence represented dignity and possibility. For others, it brought uncertainty and disruption. The end of rule did not resolve every issue, but it ended the authority that had shaped them. Responsibility now rested within the nation itself. The legacy of these final years remains complex. Wartime governance intensified control while undermining trust. Economic strain deepened hardship. Administrative fatigue weakened authority. Together, these forces pushed the Raj toward its conclusion. The institutions of empire did not vanish overnight. Railways, laws, and administrative habits remained. Yet the power behind them had changed. What had once been imposed was now inherited, to be reshaped by national priorities. The period from 1939 to 1947 stands as a passage rather than a moment. It shows how global conflict can alter local destiny. How systems built over generations can collapse under sustained pressure. How authority can fade quietly, even as it appears intact. The British Raj ended not because it was overthrown in a single act, but because it could no longer sustain itself. War revealed its limits. Time eroded its foundations. Independence emerged as the only viable path forward. This final chapter of imperial rule is defined by exhaustion and transition. It marks the close of an era and the opening of another. From wartime strain to national freedom, the journey was shaped by resilience, sacrifice, and irreversible change. The system that ruled for decades collapsed, and in its place rose a nation determined to chart its own course. The British Raj was a powerful system of rule, built on administration, law, and control. It brought order and infrastructure, but also inequality and resistance. Its legacy shaped nations, borders, and memories. Understanding the British Raj helps us understand the limits of empire and the strength of people seeking self-rule. Thank you for listening and for walking through history with care. May knowledge of the past guide wiser choices for the future. Until next time, take care and stay curious.